This Thursday night on BBC One. Later than billed, it's Newscast.
Chris, I think this is a rare moment of disagreement between the two of us.
Oh, yeah?
And it's about Nadeem Zahawi's resignation letter saying he's standing down as a Tory MP and won't contest the next election.
What did you think of it then?
I thought it was one of the cheesiest letters I've seen in British political history.
Hey, come on, he's the MP for Shakespeare.
He does this quote.
Stratford-upon-Avon. He's got to be allowed a little bit of lyricism and words. We've got to, reporters revere words because we can quote them.
He says, he quoted, it's from Measure for Measure, and he says, "Go to your bosom, knock there, and ask your heart what it doth know." What I will say, though, is the word bosom's not used in British politics that often. So it's interesting to see that make a comeback.
Well, yes, bosom and doff are two words of not many letters that, perhaps deserve a broader outing.
Anyway, thank you very much for clasping us to your bosom for this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And it's Chris in the studio.
And I notice you've just hot-footed it to the studio from the City of London, where the news was today, because the Bank of England made its regular decision about interest rates, and they are staying at 5.25%. Does that have political ramifications?
I think it does, because it just taps into the thing that perhaps often with the various rows and elections and defections and stuff that makes news at Westminster can occasionally cloud what we as journalists know, and the political parties who are very aware there's a general election coming know, which is the biggest issue by a mile when they do their focus groups with voters, or they're out knocking on doors, or when we're doing our stuff out and about as reporters. And this is to state the bleeding obvious, but it can't be stated often enough. The biggest issue by a mile to people is the cost of living. Ultimately, the economy, the vitality or otherwise of the economy. And how do people measure that? They don't measure it in GDPs or interest rates or whatever. They measure it in how well off or not you feel. And that's the big, big topic.
That's the politics of it. I got a little insight into the economics of it while Chris was making his way here from the city, slightly more slowly than we were expecting, because I caught up with BBC
I got lost.
I caught up. I'm sorry to reveal your movements. I caught up with BBC Chief Economics Correspondent Darshini David and the former Chief Economist for the Bank of England and now Chief Exec of the Royal Society of Arts, Andy Haldane. Darshini, hello.
Adam, hello. Thanks for having me back.
And Andy, welcome back too.
Adam, thank you. Love to be here.
So, Darshini, journalists, we like things when they're dramatic and things changing, but interest rates didn't change. Does that mean it was boring?
I knew it. You brought the B word into it already. It is not boring. It's all about the fine print. There's 86 pages of fine print. How can it be boring? 1.6 million people remortgaging this year. They all want to know what's going on with interest rates. So we're inching closer to that first cut. Inching, but we are getting there. And if you believe the Governor of the Bank of England, he says we're turning the corner. Discuss.
What does he mean? What corner have we turned?
What corner have we turned? The growth outlook is looking better. In fact, if you stick around for a few more hours, we should get confirmation that we are out of that pretty short-lived recession. And on top of that, if you look at where we're looking at inflation, imminently, we should hear it's back down to the 2% target. And then the question comes, so why aren't we cutting interest rates? Because the bank needs it to stay there for some time. And there's some people on that panel who are just not sure it's the case. But I'm sure Andy's got all sorts of interesting views on that one.
Well, yeah, because there's 9 people on the Monetary Policy Committee. Last time round, one person was in favour of a rate cut. This time round, 2 people are in favour of a rate cut. How would you have voted, Andy?
Oh, I'd have been cutting from some way back, Adam, actually.
Oh, really? When?
Start of the year.
Right.
So
where would interest rates be now in your parallel universe?
I'd probably have done a couple. I'd be 4 3/4 or something by now, I think. I'd have got a couple in.
Okay.
I'm fearful that, we're going to have a sort of symmetric version of 2021. So 2021, bank was 6 months too late in raising rates when inflation picked up. And I think this time it risks being 6 months too late in getting them back down again as inflation falls. So I'd have been on my bike start of the year.
And so what's the kind of structural thing that means a central bank like the Bank of England is going to make that mistake again, as far as you see it?
Well, I mean, we're
just
all
in the other direction.
To some extent, we're all prisoners of history, right? Fighting the last war. And I understand the concern that with the inflationary cat having got out of the bag pretty decisively, actually, they want to be doubly, trebly sure that it's back in before cutting rates. But actually, the corner on inflation was decisively turned at the start of the year. We're going to find probably inflation below target and the economy still, stumbling sideways, really, whatever comes of the Q1 GDP number. And that's a recipe for cutting, not holding. And I think we've been a touch slow in both directions.
Darshini, what's the economists then doing on the other hand? What's on the other hand for that?
Well, on the other hand, you've got those 7 people who are saying, well, hang on a minute, there are still those risks out there on the horizon, that you've got services inflation that's fueled by spending largely. Is still
that's at 6%, isn't it?
And you've got wage inflation still higher than some would like to see, although, thank goodness it is outpacing inflation for a lot of people now, which is, a big relief. But it's really curious because looking at that voting record, and I was thinking this today, we're always kind of thinking that there's the insiders, aren't there, at the bank on the panel, and there's the external members, and you always think of those internal members as moving as a pack. And then we saw one break away today and vote for a cut. How usual is that?
Well, it's more typical that insiders vote together rather than apart. That's true. But it's not a question. When I was on the committee back in 2021, that period, I was the one outsider voting for rate rises and the 8 others were voting to stick. So it's not out of the question. It's happened before.
But how easy is it to dissent in that room? Because it does seem, doesn't it, like a bit of an opaque structure.
Well, yeah, how much of a hothouse is it? And how much do you get the thumb screws put on you to it all be unanimous?
No, not at all, really. Because the truth is they are all individually, formerly me, individually accountable to Parliament for their vote. So there's no hiding. And I think everyone takes that pretty seriously, actually. So ultimately, you stand behind your vote. And block voting is just not the done thing, I don't think, not for me at least.
Right, let's hear from the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, who did a press conference today around this decision. And he was asked a lot of questions about what the future path of interest rates is going to be, but he didn't really give a lot of answers.
To make sure that inflation stays around the 2% target, that inflation will neither be too high nor too low, it's likely that we will need to cut bank rate over the coming quarters and make monetary policy somewhat less restrictive over the forecast period.
OK, so he's dropping a pretty big hint there, Darshini. It's just not now, but pretty soon.
Cancel the summer holidays, Adam. We're going to be back here. That's my bet, is that we're either going to say, and you talk to the economists out there, reading the rooms of all of this, and they're saying 50-50 June, if not definitely August, and probably one more at least to come before the end of the year. But basically what he's saying there in central bank language, if I may put it that way, is, we have to look at the evidence on this, and not enough people are convinced by the evidence, and that's really what's moving the dial here.
And Darshini, what is happening with mortgage rates? Because, again, reading my financial pages this morning, I could see that some mortgages for first-time buyers were going back up to 5%. Yeah. And we thought they'd come down from that. So what's going on there?
It's been that picture, and Andy was alluding to it there, that, we saw some in the markets going, oh my goodness, they're having a wobble over in the US. And if they're delaying there, we're delaying here. So you saw a bit of a split, actually, in expectations between some in the financial markets and economists. Economists saying the evidence says just that our fundamentals mean we should be cutting pretty soon. People in the markets are going, no, they're doing that over there, therefore wait a bit. Mortgage rates are tied to those expectations. And that's why you saw them sort of bubbling up a little bit. And that's why you're seeing some of the pain that, borrowers are going through. It's really fascinating because we all know, obviously, all that talk of economy turning the corner and coming up to this election, how are punters going to feel? I was talking to one person earlier who's remortgaging, and his take on this was, this is the government's fault. The government should be helping me. The government is letting the Bank of England put up interest rates. They bailed us out in COVID, bailed us out during the energy price shock. Why aren't they doing it this time round? Which raises all sorts of questions.
Well, yeah, that's economically that person is not correct, are they? Or politically? Well, politically they feel how they feel. But yeah, what would you say to that voter, Andy?
Well,
so just explain that story to them.
Well, we've gone through a couple of years now of the economy crabbing sideways. The surprising thing actually is that it didn't do a lot worse than that. We've seen a massive squeeze on people's pay packets as a result of inflation. We'd have expected the economy to be contracting sharply, for spending to be contracting sharply. And it would have done were it not for two things. One is support from the government to households and to businesses. That support has been there. And the second thing is households running down their savings to protect their spending in the face of contracting incomes. So we can't be in endless life support mode, I think, if you're the government. And now with inflation having come back, as Darshini mentioned, real pay, inflation-adjusted pay is now picking up. And that support is not needed. What we do need, though, I think, is to reduce the restrictive stance of monetary policy. Because right now, although the economy may be starting to edge up, having crabbed sideways, it's still subpar growth on any metric imaginable. People are still losing their jobs, we think. Unemployment's picking up. Unfilled vacancies are ticking down. This still feels like an economy that hasn't got its mojo back. And that's why interest rate cuts, I think, are better coming sooner rather than later.
Darshini, just kind of the basics here of... So if you're watching, if you're about to like either remortgage or get your first mortgage, and you're watching the news to see what the Bank of England does about interest rates, what actually is the precise link between the bank rate and like what the bank would say to person X buying their house?
Sorry, you mean what is the link between the mortgage rate and what the Bank of England is up to?
Yeah, so like if they cut rates in a couple of months' time, does that mean that the rate on your mortgage will go down?
Yes, but in the meantime, if they are expected to cut rates sooner than previously thought, which is the case now, and it does take a bit of time, you are likely to see those rates starting to drift down. Which, of course, is very good news for those people who are, and we still have got, we reckon, about 1 million households left to remortgage over the course of this year. And we shouldn't forget those first-time buyers who are sitting on their hands right now thinking, are things going to get better? And also those buy-to-let landlords as well, and those renters, all those people who are sitting out there anxiously waiting. We should see some movement in the coming weeks, even if we don't see the Bank of England doing anything for a month or two. How much, though? Depends on the bank.
Right, Andy, you did a speech at the RSA, the organisation of which you're the chief exec now, on Wednesday night. Lots of ideas in it, but the main one was we're just being a bit like, we're not kind of being brave enough. Like all of us, in whether we go and get a new job, let alone set up a new company.
I think that's right, Adam. That was the gist of the story. That
glad I read that speech, right?
I mean, the world's a risky place. Let's be clear. An instinctive response to risk is to hunker down. But we know if everyone hunkers down and takes no risk, then nothing entrepreneurial happens, and the result is the sort of soggy growth picture we've had for the better part of 15 years and counting. We have right now. You look at what government's doing. What companies are doing, what financial firms are doing. Everyone's shying away from bearing risk, from making those investments that we know are the wellspring of growth tomorrow. So we've, in this, 100 years ago, John Maynard Keynes, a famous economist, spoke about the paradox of thrift, right? It's a paradox because thrift we think as being a good thing. But of course, if everyone is thrifty and saves, no one's spending, and the result is collectively calamitous. And we've got a bit of that going on right now. World's a risky place. Let's hunker down. And the result is a bad situation's made worse.
Well, what I thought was so intriguing, though, is I kind of totally see that argument when it comes to business and innovation and research and development. And you've got to spend some cash to discover the new wonder drug. And maybe it won't be a wonder drug after all. But it was the fact you were saying that kind of everyone should be doing it. Or maybe you weren't instructing, but you weren't telling people to like quit their jobs today. But there was a bit of that, though. It's like people need to get used to the idea that they should, if they want a pay rise, maybe they shouldn't ask their boss for a pay rise. Maybe they should quit and go and get another job somewhere else. That's the way to get a pay rise.
Well, it's true.
And you think we've lost that spirit.
I mean, you speak to someone who's only moved job once. I know that the fastest route to a pay rise is not to stick, it's to twist. And that's true. But in terms of taking the lead on that, Adam and Darshini, it's for government. That's also what Keynes said 100 years ago. As the agent best able to bear risk, as the agent with the longest horizons, it's for them to step up and to make those investments in ways that would then encourage others in the private sector to follow suit. And that's sorely what we need now. And that's what the current fiscal rules are preventing government from doing.
Yeah, so this idea that debt has to be falling by the end of a 5-year kind of rolling period, which always strikes me as a terrible way to manage your own finances. But it seems to be kind of the accepted way for governments. I mean, what's a better set of, without getting too nerdy, what's kind of like a better set of fiscal rules that would help a future government get things revved up again?
Well, a couple of things, really. I mean, one would be 5 years is far too short for any investment that's big and transformational for the UK. And dear heavens, we need investment that's big and transformational for the UK. You know, both HS2 for the government and the Green Prosperity Plan for Labour were casualties, thin sliced by dint of those rules.
Yeah, the 28 billion that became less.
So let's stretch the horizons beyond 5 years. That's arbitrary and too short. But most importantly, not all borrowing is created equally. Borrowing that's investment for tomorrow, that creates assets, schools or hospitals or roads or railways, should be recorded and recognised in how we set our rules. So let's not look at just debt, but the assets that government creates as well, what's sometimes called net worth. And I get that people are still a bit scared by the mini budget and what that did to bond markets. But the truth is that what financial markets want first and foremost from the UK is a good growth story. And if the route to that is government borrowing, they will take that in their stride.
But Darshini, what's interesting about that is that Jeremy Hunt's not talking about changing his fiscal rules anytime soon, and Rachel Reeves has signed up to very, very similar ones.
Yeah, which I find intriguing because, you know, when you listen to what you're saying and what the economy needs, and we talk about investment, productivity, and you think, yep, that makes sense. But I'm really intrigued by what you're saying about risk. And, you know, someone who, my memory is ingrained with that idea of covering Wall Street when it all fell apart in 2006, 2007. Is that
because of too much risk? Because of too much risk.
Is that when we saw that change in attitude from governments, from the private sector, when we all went, this must never happen again? And has that translated into the way we see everything now, and therefore we're shying away from opportunities? That's what's happened.
Quite so. We are all, and I am still, having been part of it at the time, psychologically scarred by that experience. We know after the great crash of 29, that had a scarring effect on people's risk appetite and psychologies for a generation. And it's still with us now. It's framed how we think about our fiscal choices. It's framed how we think about our regulatory choices, how we think about consumer protection, how we think about corporate governance. And it's done with the best of intentions, of course. It's instinctive to want to mitigate or manage risk, except when it's not. And now's the time for not. We had too much risk then. We have too little risk bearing now. And that's why we need to turn turtle on how we think about our regulation, how we think about our rules, fiscal and more broadly.
So basically, were you hoping, I don't know if Rachel Reeves was in the front row of the speech, but I'm sure if she wasn't, she will have read it. Were you hoping that she reads it, hears it and goes, oh, actually, yeah, I need to be a bit bolder on the economy. I'm being far too cautious here.
Well, I think the message is not just for politicians. I think there's messages there for the private sector as well. Certainly messages for regulators. I was a regulator in my former life. You know, I'm partly responsible for some of this stuff, right? The rules for banks, the rules for insurers, which I think have been starving British companies of the financial fuel they need to grow, has been part of the problem. It was part of the solution in 08, 09. It's part of the problem now. It's ridiculous that there are, you know, more Canadian, Australian and Dutch pensioners investing in British businesses than there are British pensioners investing in British business. That needs to change. It's ridiculous that there's been no net lending to companies by British banks over the past several years. That needs to change. We will not grow unless it changes. So this needs to be broadly based. It needs to involve finance. It needs to involve companies outside of finance. It needs to involve our government in a national plan for growth and regeneration. Because looking for someone else to lead will mean that no one leads and we remain stuck in the mud as we have done for, now, 15 years we've been stood still.
Also, I love the bit in your speech when you said, if I want to cheer myself up, I get as far away as possible from Westminster. In other words, you go and hang out with some mayors, some newly elected mayors or re-elected mayors.
Well, the truth is, I mean, despite all I've said, I'm actually strangely optimistic about the UK because I see huge amounts of potential, latent energy, in the UK's regions and nations. I visit them a lot now. And there are clusters of brilliant businesses, brilliant universities, brilliant people, scattered across the four corners of the UK. And if they could be given, enabled to become masters of their own destiny, the UK could fly. So of all the things we might do, empowering, and indeed with a bit of money, put them the way of local leaders, we'd have a national growth plan built from the bottom up, turning those brilliant clusters and institutions into superclusters. That's what we need. We know how to do it.
Yeah.
It's about execution.
So interesting. Darshini, thank you very much. And Andy, thanks to you too.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Darshini.
So that's the sort of view from the city. Talking of views from the city, why did it take you so long to cover that short distance from there to here?
So I got lost. So how
long have you lived here? 23 years?
Something like that.
We moved here in the same year.
We did indeed.
2001.
In 2001. Not been here every year since, but most of them. And I got lost. So the thing is, there's a circle line in the middle of the London Underground, the yellow line for people who are familiar with London, or perhaps more familiar than me. And the whole thing about east and west, the whole east and west thing in a circle, particularly when you're on the edge of the circle where it kind of goes south. Anyway, we stood on one platform for quite a while and then realised we were going the wrong way, or would get on the wrong way if we got on the train, and then went to the other side. So sorry, I got lost in London about 15 minutes away from where I work.
See, we can even make great podcasting content out of you getting on the wrong tube platform. We can find some political significance in it. Anyway, talking about political significance, it's the day after Natalie Elphicke magically morphed from being a Conservative MP, and some people say a very right-wing one, whatever that really means, to becoming a new Labour MP, although she's not going to fight her seat at the next election. Isn't it interesting that story very quickly went from, whoa, what a political bombshell, to, was this a good idea for Labour to sign her up?
Yeah, and there's a couple of things. There's the thing that always happens with defections, which is that there's a tribal excitement at luring someone from the other side, and then there's some within the tribe who regard it as somehow a bit sort of, I don't know, kind of dirty or discombobulating or not quite right, because how can you possibly be Labour if you were Conservative? But the twist with the Natalie Elphicke defection, yes, there's some who might point to elements of her politics that they regard as on the right. I think there's other bits that you can point to. The left-right stuff is only of so much use, and there's some stuff, particularly around housing, that's been her sort of lifelong or adulthood-long professional interest, where actually her views pretty much and long have arguably tessellated with that of the Labour Party. But crucially is this particular element of her recent backstory, really, which is that her ex-husband, former MP for the same seat, who was convicted of sexual assaults, she said in an interview in The Sun, best part of 4 years ago, that he was attractive and he was attractive to women, and that perhaps that made him an easy target. And that had led some Labour MPs to be upset, furious, angry at what they saw as victim blaming. Anyway, the reason I was in the City of London was to talk to Natalie Elphicke, who was at an event there, and here's what she told me.
About that period of my life, it was an incredibly difficult and stressful period. But I do recognise it was much worse for all of those people, all those women who had to give evidence at that time. And so I would like to take the opportunity to apologise to them.
Will that reassure her new colleagues enough?
I think it'll do quite a lot, actually, to take the sting out of it. So I speak to a lot of them privately, and they said they hated the kind of language that she'd used, but they said she should have an opportunity to explain it and apologise. And she's apologised, and no doubt in private conversations with plenty of them, she'll seek to explain it in terms of, as she was saying there, how difficult a period in her life it was. And it was quite striking talking to her, actually. It wasn't a normal political conversation. Of course it wasn't. You're talking about something deeply, deeply personal. So I think it will go some way, actually, to doing that, and then the conversation shifts back to policy stuff.
Now, finally, one of the days when you weren't here, I launched our new marketing campaign.
Oh, yes, which I got wind of when I was a recipient.
When you became in the middle of it without knowing what it was. Yeah, and basically it's because Katja Adler, who we did Brexit Cast with, she's got a podcast of her own now called The Global Story, and it's got a much bigger budget and marketing budget than we could ever dream of.
I can imagine.
They had a billboard in Times Square.
What?
Yes. And so I thought, what could we do? What's the newscast version of that? And it was actually turned out to be newscasters taking pictures of themselves with our logo at their own favourite landmarks around the world. So And what better way to mark that than by doing a quiz? With
Terrific.
You, to see if you can guess the landmarks.
Oh, right.
So we're basically now doing marketing for the marketing campaign, which is about a marketing campaign. Right. First one. This is Mrs. Active.
Hello, Mrs. Active.
Very active on Discord, which
now
is
the
our app
tricky
where
thing
you
is,
can talk about.
so there is Mrs. Active with your smartphone and the Newscast logo, and something that is either the Eiffel Tower or the Blackpool Tower. And I'm thinking.
All I'll say is Mrs. Active is very well travelled in a southerly direction.
Oh, it's got to be Paris.
Correct.
I was wondering. I've gone Blackpool otherwise.
Right. This is
look
Daniel.
At that. Oh no, hang on a minute. Hello, Daniel. Now this is what I like to see, because this is the north of England. Can I just have a look at this? Because I'm thinking, is it Dales or is it Lakes? And I am thinking it's Lakes. Yeah, because the hills are bigger than the Dales. Lake District, beautiful. Oh, that's manna from heaven. That is.
That was Hallenfell in the Lake District.
Terrific. Lovely.
Well done, Daniel.
Brilliant.
Have you thought about going into like open source, like satellite photo interpretation? I think you have quite a skill for that.
I don't know. You've had to nudge me in both directions.
Right. Now, this is Stephen.
Oh, hang on a minute. That can't be Stephen. That's got to be Theresa May running through a field of wheat.
There is a field of wheat there. But you can't see Stephen himself, but there is a famous landmark.
Mount Fuji.
Correct.
Is it Mount Fuji?
Yeah, I thought it was the Lake District again, and then I was like, no, that's definitely Mount Fuji.
We've made our way to Japan.
Right.
This is terrific.
This one is from Total Landscaping, one of the users on Discord. Thanks for getting in touch, Total, if I may use your first name. Homemade Newscast logo, DIY.
Now, hang on a minute.
Where do you think
this is my new area of expertise, because it's the Underground in London. But I can't. It's the London Underground, but I can't work out which station because I can't read the sign on the station. It's quite out of the centre of London, I think that, but I've no idea where.
Pinner.
Pinner, that's well out, isn't it?
And do you know the political significance recently of Pinner Tube Station?
No, I don't.
Susan Hall.
I wondered if it might be Susan Hall, right?
Who was then the Tory candidate for mayor, who went on to lose. Some people say
her neck of the woods?
No, it's where she famously lost her Oyster card.
Oh, yes. And there was a whole question about whether or not it should have been pickpocketed.
Yes. So you see, you did remember.
I was aware of the story.
Location.
Yes. There we go.
And finally, you must remember this, as they famously sang.
I do remember this outside the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh, which is where I first encountered the viral marketing campaign.
Yeah, that I hadn't told you about. Yeah.
That I hadn't told.
And Tamsin came up.
And Tamsin came up with her in a plastic wallet Newscast logo. That was shortly after I'd inadvertently made a fool of myself on the 6 o'clock news.
Oh, yeah, the news goblin.
Yeah, by being on the telly by accident.
Yeah, and James Cook there, so she got two for the price of one and friends of the podcast.
Exactly. Brilliant.
Well done. I think, I didn't keep track of your scores. I think it was full marks.
I think it was pretty good.
Apart from Pinner, you didn't get Pinner.
I didn't get Pinner, and it kind of, bit vague on the Lake District.
The good thing about that, though, is hearing from you. We just love hearing whatever you're doing. You don't have to hold up our logo to get in touch with us. You can get in touch with an observation about the news or about this podcast or something you want to talk about or a question you want us to find the answer to. And you can email us anytime. Well, that's how email works. newscast@bbc.co.uk.
Pinner Underground Station versus Times Square. We've won.
I mean, sorry, Catcher.
Exactly.
We've beaten you in the viral marketing stakes. Anyway, Chris, thanks for making it here eventually and for dashing across London and eventually going in the right direction.
I was glad to turn up in the end.
And thank you very much for tuning into this episode of Newscast. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Newscast from the BBC.
The rules are the rules. Blood is